Hi, I'm Jonas Jackson, and Dr. Jerry Beto invited me to speak to you about my upcoming trip on the Oregon Trail. I read a lot of diaries and talked to a lot of people before we headed for Independence, Missouri, which is the launching spot of the Oregon Trail. I want to first talk about what happens at Independence, Missouri in the spring of 1848. We have to prepare for the trip by first purchasing some oxen and a wagon. Horses would not make the long trip on the Oregon Trail, so we have to use those durable oxen. But I've read they are not very smart. They're fairly dumb and slow animals, but they're going to pull our wagon. We now have to decide what to take in the wagon and not to overload the wagon. Good old Granny, she wants to take the piano, but the piano ain't going to fit in the wagon. But we still seem to overload the wagon with our possessions. And we also bring food that will not perish. We're going to eat a lot of powdered milk and soda crackers on the trip, which sometimes causes, as I read from the diaries, fairly severe stomach problems. Finally, we gather with other families there in Independence, Missouri, and hire a captain who's going to be our guide and the leader of our wagon train with other families heading for Oregon. It is now time to leave. We thank those that helped us with the preparations, and we now head out on the Oregon Trail. As I found out from the diaries I read, the Oregon Trail is nothing but wagon ruts across the land. And we now begin to encounter the problems that I know we're going to face as we travel to Oregon on the Oregon Trail. We have to deal with the terrain, which is quite bumpy and difficult often to cross. And of course, we immediately hit a dust storm. And the next day, we know we're going to hit a rainstorm. And the weather is going to be a problem throughout our trip on the Oregon Trail, along with the oxen, who are very slow and methodical in pulling us across the land. Crossing a river is always a problem, as we find the oxen are very slow in crossing the river. And I told you at times they are very dumb, because I've heard that some of the oxen stop in the middle of the river and drown themselves, which is not overly smart. So we have to make sure the oxen do cross the river, and then we have to continue across the land. Okay, let's continue to talk about the problems we know we're going to face as we travel across the Oregon Trail. I've described the terrain as a problem, the wagon ruts in the land. We have the problem of the weather and crossing the rivers and going up and over mountains. Along the way, we see geographic highlights. We see Chimney Rock. We see Independence Rock. These are geographic highlights that stand out and are markers along the trail. And as we pass by these, many of us are going to get out and write on the rock and see the names and dates of those that have gone before us. As we travel along, the wagon is too heavy, and we are now going to have to dispose of a lot of items and leave it along the side of the trail. And as we travel toward Oregon, we see that many others have thrown their possessions out as they traveled along the trail. We see a lot of furniture that has become very dry and very destroyed along the trail. Food has been a problem, and as we continue to head toward Oregon, we know that many of those ahead of us had gotten cholera, and the food had a lot to do with it. Cholera, I know from reading the diaries, is the main disease of travel along the trail, and many lost family members to cholera. As we continue to travel west, we see little white grave markers where individuals have buried their family members as they traveled along the trail. So we went by Independence Rock, Courthouse Rock, Chimney Rock, which were geographic markers. We were heading for Fort Hall, one of the few sites of civilization along the trail, and we're heading now toward Idaho and toward Oregon. The weather has turned cold even though it is the spring. We have survived dust storms. We have survived massive rainstorms, and now we encounter a little bit of snow as we leave the Rockies, head through Idaho toward Oregon. This was quite an adventure. Most of us walked along the side of the wagon as the oxen pull the wagon across the land. Usually only the women and younger members of the family and older members of the family rode in the wagon. We virtually walked the entire way to Oregon. And we are getting close to Oregon City, which is our final destination. We've left our farms, we've left our friends, we've left some family members behind, and we are now looking for a new life in Oregon and for new adventures in Oregon. I want to thank Dr. Jerry Beto for letting me describe my travels with my family in the spring of 1848, arriving in Oregon in early fall of 1848. This is what travel is like, the real travel on the Oregon Trail. It was filled with a lot of challenges and a lot of sadness from the loss of many family members. Again, thank you for letting me talk about my trip.